The 2024 Polyglot Gathering is brought to you by Glossica.
Good morning, everyone. Kumusta? Okay. Well, I guess some of you already know a little bit of Tagalog, but for those that didn't know Tagalog, what language do you think, what kind of came to mind first when I said kumusta? Yeah. But, you know, it wouldn't, if you said Spanish, I don't blame you. But it is Tagalog. And if you know Philippine history, it's something that you wouldn't come as a surprise to you that it sounds like Spanish. But if you don't know Philippine history, well, that's what I'm here for today. We're going to go over sort of the evolution of Tagalog over the course of the history of what is the country now known as the Philippines, kind of looking at the pre-colonial times, going through the colonization period under Spain and the United States, and looking into even the things that have been happening since the Philippines became an independent country in the 20th century. So that's going to be what we're looking at. And I added this little part here that doesn't appear in the actual title about, or is it Filipino? Because if you're also sort of familiar with Tagalog, that has been a bit of a controversy or debate between, is it Filipino, is it Tagalog? So I wanted to talk about that, and that's something that happens more recently and hasn't actually been resolved. And spoiler alert, I'm not actually going to answer whether it's Tagalog or Filipino, but I'll try to tell you what the context is. And speaking of context, I wanted to sort of explain or just share a little bit of why I decided to do this presentation. And basically, I've been living in Spain for a couple of years now, and I've come across a lot of Spanish people and Spanish speakers that once they find out that I'm from the Philippines, they would ask me, is Spanish related to Filipino, or is it similar to Tagalog? And it makes sense. I mean, they were there for a long time, but they're still two completely different languages, two different language families. And so my answer is, yeah, there are words that are similar, but the grammar is completely different. And then sort of on the other side, I've also been learning Indonesian recently, and I've had some people who learned about that, and knowing that Indonesian and Tagalog are similar, they ask me, does it make it easier for you to learn Indonesian, knowing Tagalog? And that one makes sense too, because they're from the same language family, right? You would think that it helps, and it does, but at the end of the day, my answer ends up being the same as before, which is there are words that are similar, but the grammar is completely different. So sort of having that conversation with different people, I've decided, you know what, let's just kind of lay it all out and see what Tagalog is and what it isn't, and voila. So, ooh, that's French. I didn't expect that. All right, so quick overview of today. It's kind of ambitious, but let's see where we can get to. Just a quick overview of the languages of the Philippines, a little bit of the Tagalog language, a little bit of the grammar. I could spend a whole day on that, but we're just going to try to pick a little bit of what I think is interesting to share. A brief history of the Philippines, going into the influences on Tagalog based on that history, and then we'll see if we can get to the Tagalog versus Filipino debate. So, the languages of the Philippines. I want to sort of think about where the Philippines is, first off, which is it's right over there, Southeast Asia. It's one of those countries that people typically skip when they do a Southeast Asia backpacking trip because you have to fly there. Not very convenient, but it's worth it, I swear. So, learn Tagalog, go there, or if you want to do it the other direction, the other order, that's fine. But then you'll see sort of the countries around there, and that really plays a big role in terms of how not just the history of the Philippines turned out to be, but also the language. And there's a lot of languages that we'll see right now in the Philippines. This is a map, and Tagalog is just one of them, and that's going to be what I'll be focusing on. But official languages in the Philippines are Filipino and English. There are some 130 to 195 languages in the Philippines. Almost all are classified as Austronesian, although there are a few like Chabacano, which is a Spanish Creole, and then some varieties of Chinese, and some Spanish, but virtually it's not spoken anymore by most people. So that answers sort of a little bit the question that I was asked, whether Spanish is sort of still relevant in the Philippines. Not so much anymore. Now, a little bit Tagalog language itself. It's the most spoken L1 first language in the Philippines. The sort of where it originated or where it's centered is sort of around the capital of Manila, so the dark blue area. There's also several dialects of Tagalog in different parts of that region. And as we'll see, it's been influenced by many languages over the years. In terms of the language family, it's most related to Indonesian, Malaysian, Malagasy, Maori, and in terms of Philippine languages, Cebuano, Bicolano, Hiligaynon, Tausug, and less so with other languages such as Ilocano, Pangasinan, which are more from the north, and also Kapampangan, which is also towards the north of the island of Luzon. This was boring, so I'm not really going to go into this. But basically, this is the alphabet, sort of the summary of the sounds. This isn't really the alphabet now. We don't use this anymore, but it represents the phonemes, essentially, in Tagalog. This was a script that was used before, pre-colonial towards going to the colonial times. Not used anymore either, although there's a bit of a revival, not so much for wide usage in the Philippines, but just for personal, I would say, usage for people that are interested in learning it. And then for pronunciation, it's pretty straightforward. Consonants and vowels are pretty consistent. We have some diacritics that we use to help to know where the stress is, where the syllable stress is, and also the glottal stop. So we have the acute accent, which going up, which tells you where the accent is or the stress is. The one going down, the grave accent, is more about the glottal stop. And if you have the circumflex, it's both. And if there's no accent at all or diacritic, it's just, you would assume that it's in the second to last syllable. And these don't actually appear in any writing of Tagalog that you'll see in media. It's just for us to really learn. Or for people that are learning to understand how something's pronounced. For us, it's more just about context and knowing what we're reading. But some examples for the glottal stop, it's very important. There aren't actually a lot of words where the meaning would change. It's just that if you omit it or if you add it where it's not necessary, you might sound a little bit weird and there might be a bit of a delay for the person you're talking to understand what you're saying. So it's important. And some examples here in terms of the glottal stop differences. Although I have to say that it's not just the glottal stop that is different here. There's some other things that are happening in terms of pronunciation, but just to illustrate, we have the word suso, so just like that, suso, and then for breast, and then suso for snail, suka for vomit, and then suka for vinegar. So sort of that sound at the end of the suka. Mag-iba for to change, and then there's mag-iba for to collapse. And then last one, sasama ako for I'll join, and then there's sasama ako, meaning I'll become evil. So be careful with that. All right, grammar. I could do a whole day on grammar, but I'm just going to choose some of the particular ones that I want to share, like I said. For nouns, we don't inflect for plural. We don't do reduplication like in some other Austronesian languages. We just add the word mga, spelled MGA, before the noun. If you have your phones out asking a question why it's pronounced mga, put it down. I don't know what the answer is, but it's mga. For pronouns, wanted to note, we have inclusive we and exclusive we. But I also wanted to note in particular the pronoun kita, which is, I think is pretty unique because it's basically, the way that it's used now, it's signifies the first person singular, I, as the subject, and then the second person singular, or you singular, as the object. So, as an example, if I wanted to say, I love you all, right? So I, you, but plural, I would need to use two pronouns for each. So it would be mahal for love, ko for I, and then kayo, which is you, plural. So mahal ko kayo. But if I wanted to just direct it to one person, not saying anyone in particular, I would just need one pronoun, kita. So mahal kita. There are pronouns for I and you singular separately, but when they're together, we just use this one pronoun. And now that I've shared that with you, please use that responsibly. Don't blame me if you say that and it doesn't come out the way that you wanted it to. So don't blame me. For verbs, complex is an understatement. I'm sure some of you already sort of are familiar with that. It's inflected for different reasons: focus, trigger, aspect, voice, and so on. I'm just going to sort of explain aspect a bit. I think some other talks during this week have already sort of touched on that. Aspect, in a nutshell, is if an action has already happened, it's happening in the moment, or in the process of happening, I should say, and then if it's about to happen. Nothing about when it happens, right? Not that that's not important in the language, because we still want to convey that. But in the verb, in terms of aspect, that's sort of what we focus on. So as an example, we have the verb to cry, umiyak. And if we use the progressive aspect, meaning the one that's in the process of happening, we would say umiiyak. And if I want to say that it involves me, umiiyak ako, right? And this doesn't say anything about when it happens, past, present, or future. And that is accomplished with the time word. In this case, we can use, if we want to say it right now, we can say ngayon. So, umiyak ako ngayon. I'm not crying right now. But if you wanted to say that this was happening in the past, we would just use the same phrase, umiyak ako. But what we would change is that time word, which is, in this case, we would say kanina. So, umiyak ako kanina, I was crying earlier. And if you're familiar with Spanish, this is sort of like the imperfect past in Spanish. And sometimes we use that to introduce a second action that happens in the middle of that first action. And in that one, we would use the preterite tense. And so in this case, we can say, umiyak ako kanina nang lumitaw ang diwata. I was crying earlier when the fairy appeared. And so lumitaw over there is not in the progressive aspect, it's in the completed aspect. And so that's sort of the difference. And then, as I said, the Austronesian alignment, not touching that today. Now, a brief history of the Philippines. Looking just really quick, 5,000 years, brief. But that's when the first Austronesians arrived from Taiwan. Although there were already some groups that were living in the Philippines called the Negritos. And then many, many years later, the trade with the Indianized kingdoms in the Malay archipelago began, and also the different Chinese dynasties up north. And here we can see some of the illustrations that were made around that time of the different people and ethnic groups that were observed in Manila. And then this is sort of the 900 CE was the beginning of sort of the recorded history of the Philippines. And in 1521, Ferdinand Magellan from Spain arrives in the Philippine archipelago. Now, if we zoom into that last part, in the last 500 years, it begins shortly after Magellan arrives. We have the Spanish occupation, which we can see takes up a lot of time in the Philippines. And a huge part of that was the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade, which is a trade route that was established by the Spanish between the Philippines and Spain through Mexico. And basically, one of the first instances of globalization in the world ever. And then the Philippine Revolution happens around the same time the Spanish-American War, where Spain lost, gave the Philippines to the US, and then they occupied it for 50 years. And then from 1946 on, it's now what we recognize as the Republic of the Philippines. And then I was born at some point in that in that period. And then yeah, influences in Tagalog based on that knowledge. We'll just kind of go through there. The ones I'm going to really go into today are from Malay, Sanskrit, Tamil, Hokkien, Arabic, Spanish, and English. So most of the influence are through loan words. So that's why sometimes, people that speak some of these languages, well, mostly I would say Malay and Spanish, and I guess English, would think, wow, they are somehow speaking my language. It's because of the loan words, and we'll go over some of those. Some of the languages that have also had some influence include Japanese, Nahuatl, and Quechua, and of course other languages in the Philippines. But we won't go into those too much today, or at all. So, Malay. So first off, they are both Austronesian languages. So there are cognates that exist in both languages. So that's not what I'm talking about here. But I do want to note just some of the cognates that do exist. Ako, meaning I used it earlier. Kame, bili, to buy in Tagalog. It's bali in Malay, or I know Indonesian more, so maybe I should say Indonesian. Puti, white. Puti for white also in Malay or Indonesian. Some words for the body like utak in Tagalog for brain, but otak in Indonesian. Mata for eye, mata for eye in Tagalog, in Malay. Now, in terms of the actual influence, I'm talking more about later on. These two languages sort of, I guess, evolved and diverged a long, long time ago. But around the time when the trade started to happen between the Philippines and the Malay archipelago, at that time, there were these powerful kingdoms and influential kingdoms that arose in that Malayan archipelago. And Old Malay ended up becoming a lingua franca of the whole region. And so you can see, or you'd be able to imagine, that a lot of these traders and these important people would go to the Philippines, or at the time, just the Philippine archipelago, and started using Old Malay, and then it ended up being acquired, by the people, the Tagalog people there, and then the loan words, of course, followed. And then sort of just some of the examples here. Now, I just also want to note, I chose, there's in the research that I've seen, there's a lot of, a long list of words, but I chose the ones that are actually people from the Philippines or people that speak Tagalog would be able to recognize, that they're in common use. Maybe they're not in common use, but then if they saw it, they'd know what it is. So these are some of the loan words. Bunso for youngest child, kanan for right-hand side, and bibingka, which is one of my favorite desserts in the Philippines. So if you ever get there, you should try that. I want to jump over to over here, the last three words, because they're super interesting. Because they're not actually Malay words; they're Tagalog innovations. At some point, Malay ended up becoming a prestigious language, or it wasn't just that loan words were brought into Tagalog. Some Tagalog people actually started speaking Malay, and then they decided to create some new words using what they knew of Malay. So here, we have the word tanghali for noon and midday, which doesn't exist in Malay, but it comes from two Malay words, tanga, which is half, and hari, which means day. And then someone just decided, let's put it together and call it noon. And so that's an interesting sort of way that Malay has contributed to the Tagalog language. And then Sanskrit and Tamil. There's actually no evidence of there being direct contact between the Indian subcontinent and the Philippines, for the most part. This is mostly through, as we saw on the map earlier, right? India was closer to Malaysia, or that area, so then they influenced Old Malay and then kind of brought loan words into Old Malay, and then Old Malay had those Sanskrit and Tamil words and then brought it over to the Philippines. So that's how we ended up with these words. So some of the common words are, for example, here, ganda, for beauty or beautiful. I'm not going to try to pronounce the Sanskrit words because I'm not too familiar with the phonology there, but if you are, feel free to whisper it to yourself. guro for teacher. And then some other interesting words too that aren't just nouns or adjectives, but like prepositions and conjunctions like mula, samantala, and upang. And then some of them, as I mentioned, came through Malay. So halaga, meaning price, value, or worth. There's a word currently in Malay, harga, for the same, that has the same meaning. From Tamil, we're just going to focus on this one word because if you speak Spanish, this has been kind of an interesting interaction that I've had where they see this word and they're like, what is this? Like, why do you have this word here? It's vulgar in Spanish. But in the Philippines, in Tagalog, it's a rice cake, you know? So we'll see the word puto a lot in all over the Philippines. But it's not our fault, you know, if you're Spanish or if you speak Spanish and you see this word, don't blame us, blame Tamil. It came from the word, I think, if I'm pronouncing this correctly, putru. Please, if you speak Tamil, I'd like to know how that actually was pronounced. But yeah, and then also bagay, very common word, gulay, even though sometimes they say we don't have enough vegetables in our food in the Philippines, but you know, we still have this word, and so on. All right, now Hokkien. Again, looking at the geography, we have China right up here north. A lot of the interaction happened mostly between the southern region of China with Manila and also some other parts of the Philippine archipelago. And in that part, what was spoken most was Hokkien, a southern Min language. So a lot of the loan words from Chinese actually come from Hokkien. So then this trade happened before, like pre-colonial times, but then also when the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade started, sort of wealth or just sort of becoming more active here in Manila, and then more immigrants came from that part of China. So then that also was part of the process of when the loan words were coming. This is, so a few of the words. I wanted to sort of note ate and kuya, very common words in Tagalog. If you know Filipinos, you probably have heard this being used. It's what they use to refer to an older sister and older brother. Ate for older sister, kuya for older brother. So I have two younger sisters, and they call me kuya, just kuya. They don't even say the name. And sometimes I ask myself if they still know my name because I've only heard them call me kuya. So that came from Hokkien. And also a lot of words relating to food. If you know lumpia and pancit from the Philippines, that it came from Hokkien, the words, and probably also the recipes. So thank you for that. And with Arabic, sort of similar with the Sanskrit Tamil story in terms of there wasn't a lot of sort of evidence of direct contact of Arab traders, with the Tagalog region. It was more through the Islamization of the region of Malay, and then kind of Arabic loanwords came into Malay, and then afterwards into Tagalog. But then there's also the Spanish route in terms of we know that Spanish also borrowed a lot of words from Arabic, and then through the Spanish, it then made its way into Tagalog. And so some of the words, salamat, thank you, came from Arabic. Salabat for ginger tea. Alak for liquor. That one came through Malay. And then if we look over here, for alahas, jewelry, that came through Spanish. And these words also came through Spanish. Now, the big hitter, Spanish. I didn't say how many words from the other languages sort of contributed to Tagalog, but I know for Spanish it's about 20% has been found to. Well, it's just 20% of the words in Tagalog have been found to come from Spanish, and so the quick summary is that 333 years of Spanish occupation. The name Philippines actually came from Spanish because of King Felipe II. And the history is basically schooling was a priority when they came to be delivered by Catholic missionaries. And at first, they didn't want to use Spanish to teach. They wanted to learn the native languages to teach. But at some point, it did end up being taught in schools and universities. So this is a mere fraction of all the words that exist, but some of the interesting ones would be, as I mentioned earlier, kumusta, to greet, say hi, how are you? Some really common verbs also, puede and gusto. Puede for can or may, and gusto for like. Now, these are not conjugated at all as they would be in Spanish. They remain like that. So we don't say puedo, puedes, puede, podemos. None of that. It's just puede. And same thing for gusto. It's always going to be gusto. And I guess for that matter, kumusta doesn't get, even though it comes from cómo está, cómo estás, it doesn't change into the form. Some other ones, viaje for travel, trabajo, baño. This one's interesting, sibuyas, which comes from cebolla. And cebolla is one onion, but for us, we kind of kept the S when cebollas would be plural, but then for sibuyas in Tagalog, it just refers to one onion. And we learned earlier how to make that plural by just adding mga in front, so we would say mga sibuyas for onions. So some of the change in the spelling that happened when loanwords were brought in from Spanish. This one I'm not going to get into too much today, but there's another sort of interesting phenomenon that happened where we've now taken some of the suffixes that we understand or that are from Spanish, and we started applying it to non-Spanish words. So in this case, the ado suffix for making the past participle in Spanish. So yeah, we're not going to get too much into that. But so it's kind of just beyond loanwords. We also took some of the rules from Spanish grammar into Tagalog. Now, English. So we saw that after the Spanish gave the Philippines to the U.S., they were there for about 50 years. And so they sent teachers over. They wanted to establish a public school system in the Philippines, and they wanted to use English as the language of instruction. And so basically through that, English proliferated in the country. And until now, now it's one of our official languages, so it's there. It's kind of difficult to say which English words have become loanwords into Tagalog, because for the most part now, if you hear an English word in Tagalog, it could be considered just code switching and code mixing. So I'm not going to list most of them, but I do want to note a couple that have interesting etymologies. For example, like apir for a high five. And it comes from up here. And I don't know if it's in a lot of English-speaking countries, but in the U.S., if you say up here, you're asking someone to give you a high five. But we've kind of turned it into a verb where apir, apir tayo, let's do a high five. And of course, it's been respelled as APIR. And then also we have this word here, tambay, which someone who loiters. Basically, like if you're walking around Manila, let's say, and you see someone there doing nothing, you would call them a tambay. Oy, tambay, tambayan. It comes from standby, and you can sort of see how it's related. Standby, they're just standing there doing nothing. But we've taken that word standby and then sort of shifted the pronunciation, and now we have the word tambay. And then some of the other English words that we use now are a lot of the more technical words, like we would probably say computer, or maybe with more of a computer accent from Tagalog. The code switching and code mixing, there's sort of two, well, that's another word for Spanish speakers that might be interesting. We have Taglish and Konyo English, sort of two levels, which have some subtleties into them. Taglish is when it's more the base is Tagalog, but then you insert English words, but then Konyo English is sort of the opposite. But I wouldn't call it I wouldn't call anything that has English as its base and then Tagalog words inserted as Konyo English. It's just sort of, it's more of a social cultural thing, or there's sometimes even a class thing, so that you would find some people that would speak Konyo English, mostly in Manila. But the difference is, so we have this one sentence. Tell me what happened yesterday when you and your boyfriend broke up, right? So in Taglish, you would say, ikwento mo naman sa akin what happened kahapon nung nag-break kayo ng boyfriend mo. And I underlined the words that were replaced from Tagalog into English. So what happened, nag-break, so, breaking up, basically. But then it was conjugated with Tagalog rules, and then boyfriend. The alternative would have been ang nangyari, naghiwalay, and kasintahan for all those words. So it would have been, ikwento mo naman sa akin ang nangyari kahapon nung naghiwalay kayo ng kasintahan mo. So that would have been pure Tagalog for the most part. But then Taglish kind of changed that. Now for Konyo English, the interesting with verbs is that it's conjugated using the word make with the Tagalog verb. Again, there's also levels to this, so this isn't the only way. But the same sentence would be, may kwento to me naman what happened kahapon when you and your boyfriend broke up. So it's like a different way of I guess this one is more of like an English dialect more than a Tagalog dialect, right? But that's how it would be different. So instead of tell, you would say may cuento. So cuento is to tell already in Tagalog, coming from Spanish. But in Konyo English, you would add make cuento. And then kahapon for yesterday. And then naman is one of these words that we add to kind of soften a request when we're asking someone to do something for us. So that's sort of how English has infiltrated Tagalog. Now, going into the discussion about Tagalog versus Filipino, it's, like I said, it's not an easy topic really to breach. I'll just go over it really quick. It's supposed to be the standardized version of Tagalog, and the idea is that it's supposed to be open to loan words from other languages. So it's the language that's supposed to be spoken everywhere. But as we said, Tagalog is just one language in the Philippines, and there's a lot of other languages. And so Filipino ended up being based on Tagalog for many different reasons, which some people, a lot of people, are sort of in disagreement with. But basically, let's see, I'm kind of running out of time. I guess I'll focus on the case for them being the same, is that Filipino and Tagalog are mutually intelligible. You can understand, if you're speaking Filipino, speaking Tagalog, you'll be able to understand each other. It's just that Filipino would have more loan words, but then typically people would know these loan words anyway. And it's just that Filipino is just sort of considered a variant of the Tagalog spoken in Manila. So they're essentially the same. But in terms of the difference, sometimes they say it's just that Tagalog uses, as I said, all Tagalog words, but then Filipino takes in new words, theoretically, from also other Filipino languages and other languages from outside the country. But the problem is Tagalog had already acquired many of these borrowings from over the course of its history, as we saw earlier today. So when Filipino, the concept, was created in the 20th century, it somehow redefined Tagalog as just being Tagalog, and now came up with this concept where Filipino is the version that has the loan words. So it's an interesting sort of redefinition that happened. And now if you speak Tagalog, you come off as too formal, academic, or too poetic, and you would sound kind of weird when you're speaking to people, especially if you're in Manila. And of course, the Filipino being based in Tagalog kind of connotes a preference for the Tagalog region over all the others in the Philippines. And now there's actually sort of pushes for English to be the only official language of the Philippines, to kind of even the playing field. And also because a lot of people know English more than Tagalog or Filipino in the other parts of the country. I was going to compare it to some other situations in other countries, especially Indonesia, which is super interesting. But I'll just end it there. And if you have any questions related to those topics, feel free to ask them. But yeah, that's all. Thank you. Okay, could you explain more about Austronesian alignment and give some examples? I mean, it would take so long, but basically, so the subject and object are kind of irrelevant in the Austronesian alignment. It's more about an agent and a patient, sort of the terminology. But basically, we use markers to say what is the focus of a sentence. So we have the focus ang, A-N-G, to talk about what is being focused on for a sentence. So if we think about the verb kain, or kain for to eat, there are two forms of kain, or at least two forms, but the two forms I want to mention are kumain and kinain. And if we talk about ang being the one that marks the focus of that sentence, then kumain and kinain would have sort of a different relationship with the nouns. So, in other words, let's say I eat bread. Kumain ako ng tinapay. So, let's see, hold on. Let me use the cat eats bread, let's say. Kumain ang pusa ng tinapay. So, the focus there is the cat, ang tinapay, ang pusa. So, if we think about the sentence, the cat eats bread, we would call the cat the subject, right? But we can say that same sentence using a different form of kain, which is kinain. So we can say, kinain ng pusa ang tinapay. So now ang is before tinapay, and it's no longer the focus. And so we kind of switched the focus from what we would consider the subject to the object, but we were saying the same exact sentence. And so that's sort of how I would briefly explain that. Again, I would love to have slides to really illustrate this with some more diagrams, but that's sort of the lowdown for Austronesian alignment. Yeah, hopefully, please, by all means, come by and ask me if I can explain a bit more about it. Do people speak pure Tagalog without code switching? It's hard. I was trying last night, actually, with a friend, and I couldn't help but code switch. But we try to reduce the number of English words as much as I could. But my family, when I go home, I go to a province called Cavite, which is right outside Manila. And my cousins over there do a lot less code switching. But in Manila, it's like from almost 0 to 100. Well, yeah. But there's still some code switching that happens. If you speak pure Tagalog, like I said, you sound very academic. Next one. Why do so few people speak Spanish as opposed to English despite 333 years of Spanish occupation? So there was a little bit of, I would say, elitism maybe during the Spanish occupation, where Spanish wasn't exactly so widespread. It wasn't taught too much. But it was, like I said, but it wasn't as widespread. And then also when the Americans arrived, they wanted to sort of, they taught English, and that became the more common language in the Philippines. So I think just from one colonization to another, it kind of basically took over. And now Spanish isn't spoken as much anymore. Are there different declension rules, different ways of marking words that are taken from other languages? I guess sort of what I mentioned with, it's not really declension, but with the forming of the past participle, as I mentioned, from Spanish. Another example of that is we use ero, also from Spanish, in terms of like transforming a verb into a doer, someone who does that verb. So we use the ending ero or era or isto, ista. I think also through that, by the way, gender kind of got introduced into Tagalog, because Tagalog is a genderless language. But through some of these Spanish word endings that are inherently gendered with o and a endings, we also ended up kind of taking that in. So that's sort of how it's been influenced. Is Pablo Klein a well-known name in the Philippines? He was a Czech missionary, author of the first Tagalog dictionary. I don't think he's a well-known name. I might have come across this dictionary in my research, but I can't confirm at the moment. But interesting, I'll look into that. What's the extent of loanword usage in academic texts? Admittedly, I haven't really consumed a lot of academic texts. Also, there aren't really that many. I was reading some books about the Tagalog versus Filipino debate, and that was written, tried to be written in all Tagalog. But then, this is interesting because on the other side was an English translation. So, it was an effort to really write in Tagalog, but then they understood that it's not going to be easy. So and this is, for Filipinos, they had an English translation on the other side. So that kind of gives you an idea of where Tagalog is. What does the nag prefix mean? Nag. I'm trying to remember. Whoever asked this question, come up to me afterwards, and maybe you can ask me exactly what kind of comes to mind when you think of this prefix, and I'll try to help you out. But right now, I won't be able to answer this. Does anyone actually speak Filipino since it is a constructed language, or does it only exist on government documents and similar? Speak Filipino. I guess if you consider, if we abide by the definition that Filipino is the version of Tagalog that has the loan words, then you can say everyone speaks Filipino. That's what's taught. It's like a Tagalog base, and then we use English words, Spanish words, whatever. And so I would say that, yeah, we all speak Filipino. The question is, does anyone actually speak Tagalog? It might sound confusing, and it is. So, I try to have you guys sort of think about that more. So do all Filipinos know both Tagalog and Filipino? I would say that Filipinos know Filipino more. I would say, for example, if you go to the other regions of the Philippines that are not Tagalog, they would know Filipino more. They won't know all the deep Tagalog words. I think they would if they're trying to speak with someone from the Tagalog region like me, they would probably use the Tagalog base, and then if they don't know it, they'll use the loan words more often. So I would say Filipino is more widespread. In code switching, how do you decide which words to say in another language? Always the same ones, or is it based on feeling? Yeah, I would say based on feeling. The more, I guess, technical words are the most likely, most susceptible to being switched into English. Maybe even the longer Tagalog words would also be more susceptible to being switched into English. Like naghiwalay earlier, that's like 4 syllables, but you can just say nagbreak. So shorter. So that could be a reason that's, or how it's done. Why is lasa spelled rasa in Devanagari? I would have to look into this again. Yeah, there are some, because it's also rasa in Malay, actually. So it must have been something between that transfer, Malay and Tagalog. So yeah, I would have to look more into how that changed. And I've been learning Tagalog and found the marker participles difficult, e.g., for example, nang. What's the question? Nang is of, this one, and, but then there's also no, it's the other one. I think you're thinking about the ang, nang for Austronesian alignment. Again, I won't be able to answer that in 1 minute, so I can try to explain that maybe if you want to sit down somewhere and let me know, and then I can try to explain this better. But for this presentation, I won't be able to really go much into it. But yeah, I think that's all then. Okay. Thank you.